Welcome everyone to the Hobby Hour. My name is Jim Granado, and I'm the Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. Before we start our program, this is a reminder, please share any questions you have for our speakers in the chat. I'll do my best to ask our speakers as many audience questions as time allows. So we're in a great treat today. The collective years of public experience between our two great speakers are joining us today, and they have plenty to share. Congressman Gene Green is a Democrat first elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1972, and then won the Texas Senate in 1985. After serving 20 years in the Texas legislature, he was elected in 1992 to the newly created 29th Congressional District of Texas. Among many important achievements in Congress, Congressman Green played a pivotal role in the passage of the Affordable Care Act and came to be known as a champion of healthcare, education, and labor issues. Congressman Green is a UH graduate and a native Texan who dedicated 46 years to representing the Houston area in the state legislature and Congress until his retirement. Judge Ted Poe, a Republican, I note, is a sixth-generation Texan. He's a graduate of the UH Law Center and was appointed as Harris County Felony Court Judge in 1981, becoming one of the youngest judges in the state. Judge Poe's career as a judge spans 22 years. Judge Poe was first elected to Congress as a Republican in 2004, representing Texas' 2nd Congressional District, and served as a member of the United States Congress for 14 years until his retirement. In Congress, Judge Poe made criminal justice a signature issue. He also spent much of his time in foreign affairs and on immigration, but he's best known as a go-to force on issues like violence against women and human sex trafficking. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
To start off, I just want to ask the first question is, why get into public service? Congressman Green?
I was interested in politics in high school, and I grew up in Northside Houston. I graduated from Jeff Davis High School, and I ran for office for junior vice president, and I was lucky and I was elected senior class president in 1967 midterm, and that's when I started undergraduate. And over the years that I've just helped campaigns, and when the legislature the courts required single member districts for urban areas, because there used to be multi-member districts, and I couldn't raise that kind of money, but my wife and I did a lot of shoe leather and knocked on every door in Northside and Houston and Aldine that was in our district. And I was lucky enough, and I got elected in 1972.
Oh. What's the reason for your willingness to become a public servant?
Are you asking me? I didn't hear you.
Yeah, what got you into becoming a public servant? What was the motivation?
Oh, okay. Well, my grandmother was the most influential person in my life, and I spent a lot of time with her growing up. And she early on told me that I ought to be in some type of public office, public service. And really, I did it because she told me to. And when I first got appointed and then ran for judge in 81 and 82, people should know that all judges in Texas are elected partisan, and we are elected. We're not appointed. So I had to told her, of course. But see, she's an old-fashioned yellow dog Democrat, and I don't think she ever forgave me for being a Republican till the day she died. So anyway, ran for office, one of the first Republicans elected in Harris County, 22 years on the bench, and then resigned and ran for Congress in 2004. But always in public service. I was in the Air Force Reserves, taught school for a while, and I did it, like I said, because my grandmother told me to be in public service. So I was, and I am.
Congressman Green, what was the process? So you have this motivation to engage in public service, but is it start in high school for you, or college, or how did you start going on this path, becoming a public servant?
Is that me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I just gotten, enjoyed doing things for folks. And because I do think, as Ted knows, and you're really a public servant and you represent your constituents. Although in being a judge is a little different because the judge has laws to do. Whereas, I enjoyed helping people, get their kids in college, help neighborhoods, and my wife and I grew up in the same church in Northside. And I used to tell people that I said, every religion in the world is you need to take care of your fellow man and woman. And it's good politics, but it's also what we all should do.
Poe, what was the process for you?
Well, somewhat similar to Gene. I was in class president a couple of times when I was at Abilene Christian University. And then being a prosecutor is public service. A judge, like Gene said, you don't really represent, you represent the law and justice. But it is a unique thing for Texas, I want to reiterate, to have partisan elections. Most states don't have elections, and they certainly aren't partisan. But it's kind of old fashioned. I wanted to help other people, serve the community, serve the state. And one thing Gene alluded to that I think is very important in Congress, we don't just represent people legislatively. We have constituents who are staffs, and his and mine are excellent staffs, help individuals one-on-one get their Social Security check, get into Veterans Administration, helping people with a passport, all kinds of one-on-one things that members of Congress do. And that is all part of our job of serving the public.
Both you're from different political parties, yet you get along and you've worked together in the past. So one thing that we hear a lot of people talk about is the loss of civility in Washington, or in general in the public arena. The question I have for both of you then is, did you witness this change where things got less cooperative during your tenure in Congress, and what were the sources? Judge Poe, let's go with you on that one to start.
All right. Civility obviously is a real problem in the United States Congress right now. And when I was there serving with Gene, of course, Gene was there for forever before I got there. There was, he was,
I don't believe in term limits.
The public determines term limits. That's the way I always thought. But I got along fine with people in both parties. In some respects, maybe better with the Democrats than I did the Republicans, because the best legislation is always bipartisan. And when we pass legislation, you need the other side to get good legislation passed. And the legislation that I sponsored always had, of course, a Democrat sponsor. A lot of it was, you wouldn't think that, like Gene and I got along fine, even when I wasn't in Congress. But I had legislation with other members in the Democrat Party besides Gene, and it worked out very well. But the press normally does not report legislation that's bipartisan and people working together. They'd rather hear and report when we're fighting and fussing and feuding. And I think most legislation really was bipartisan. Some major legislation, not so. But civility is something that I was raised to be civil, and Gene probably was too. And it's not anymore. Civility is a real problem in the United States Congress, and therefore you have, I think, gridlock between the two parties. But I got along fine, and I don't know who it bothered the most that I got along so good with the Democrats or the Republicans. So anyway, we had civility. We worked together. Some of my best friends were and are members of the other party.
Congressman Green, your thoughts on this?
I knew Ted before, he came to Congress, and I thought he was a pretty square shooting guy. And we were never on the same committee. I started out in Congress, education and workforce in '93, but my goal was to get on energy and commerce because I represented, what Ted didn't have. I had the ship channel in Houston. And I used to tell people, I said, we have 5 refineries that employs thousands of people in East Harris County. And I can't even count the chemical companies out there. But that was our base for jobs in East Harris County, in East End. And when Ted got elected in that area, I wanted to work with him, and we did. We both shared the city of Baytown, and we had a town hall meeting in Lee College that was it was the gym filled up, and then we did one in what's now Lone Star College out just north of the Intercontinental Airport. We shared that area too, the spring area and around airport, and we worked on things that we could see that would help our constituents. Ted was on transportation committee, and in Houston, as we know, we still have transportation problems. But he being on the committee, and it helped us in getting some things for our community. It's not a D or an R issue; it's whether what you can do. So we wanted the community in both areas wanted flyovers. I didn't know what a flyover was except for a plane, but it's the huge off ramps, and we got the first one was one in Baytown, and I-10 and to where they could get in and out of the Baytown and get on I-10, and then around the other side of our districts, I-69 and Beltway 8, and we got federal money to do that. And Ted, I forgot about it. Remember, we were out there on Highway 90. The Highway 90 goes through northeast Harris County. It started in our district, and it went. I guess at that time you were outside of Beltway 8 out there, but we pushed to get that freeway there to take all the cars off of I-10 and give them some way to get to Houston and get to work. And it's funny because Ted and I took, we used to be able to give earmarks, and in transportation committee, you can do that. So I went to our ranking member at that time and said, I've got this, Ted Poe and I have this joint request. And he said, we don't have bipartisan earmarks. It's either yours or Ted's. And I said, well, and I told him, I said, well, he's on the committee and he has the push to get this. And I think your chairman said, we don't have a bipartisan earmark. Do you remember that, Ted? And,
well, we did anyway, and we got it passed.
We got it out, and our folks who drive on those roads, but they said, took me aside and said, we've never had that. I was like, well, maybe we ought to do it right now, because if you need a transportation system, it's not Republican or Democrat. It's
That's right.
all of them. And we were just had good relationships. Although the one I'm going to joke, because Ted was on immigration, and I was sitting on a district that was probably almost 70% Hispanic population, and so I understood the uniting families and relatives, grandmothers and grandfathers coming from Mexico, and immigration has been a problem for many years, even since they didn't want the Irish to come to the United States, and I probably wouldn't be here if that was not that. But and Ted was on the committee, and we had both done op-eds for the Baytown Sun. Obviously, I was supporting immigration, and Ted was his statement. And but that town hall meeting we had in Baytail, not a person asked us about immigration. And walking out with Ted after we finished, I can't believe they didn't ask us that. And he said, we know all these people. They said, it's kind of like you don't want to start a fight. And I think because they know where we stand. And,
but we disagreed on some of the issues of immigration, not all of them, but we weren't disagreeable. We're still civil about that. And just because you disagree with someone in the other party, we were always civil about our disagreements. It wasn't uncivil, shall I say.
Yeah.
Well,
but, we were friends, and that's what you need to realize that if you're an R or a D, you still can work with other people.
During your time, so one way to deal with this is if you get to know somebody and their history and you become quote unquote friends. Yeah. So the way to do this is socialize, go out for a drink. You have a gym there, right? I suspect lots of the representatives go to the gym every morning and talk to each other. But did you see less and less of that as it went into having parties at someone's house where it was Democrats, Republicans arguing about which baseball team was better, just things that were not about politics, it was just about each other. Did you see that lessen over time?
Well, I'll let you go first.
Yes. In the gym, that's just one example of many where you have members of Congress in both parties doing something other than congressional work, so to speak. But one thing has changed over the years. Used to, members of Congress moved to Washington, D.C. I'm talking about the House of Representatives. And then during a period of time, the public, the citizens, expected members of Congress to come home on weekends, which is fine. But that's what happens. Members of Congress are there during the week. They fly in on Sunday night or Monday morning, and then they're out Friday night and flying back home. Most of the Texas delegation did that. We would be with each other on the same planes, usually sitting in the same seats for several flights. But when you're not there in Washington on weekends, for example, your kids don't play with the neighbor's kids who happens to be somebody in the opposite party. That's what I'm saying. And so we'd fly back home and we'd be back with our own constituents over the weekends. When people had to move to Washington, they would be living in the same neighborhood or next door to people in the opposite party that would socialize with them and get to know them better. And I think that had a lot to do with maybe civility in the past, where you don't see it now, because on a weekend, all members of Congress, most of them have gone back to their home districts.
And that is so true. And I'm glad you mentioned the gym. In my younger days, in the 90s, I went and we had basketball games, and I couldn't tell you if they were a Republican or Democrat in gym shorts and an old T-shirt in a gym. I can tell you they had a good outside shot, and that happened with a lot of them. In fact, John Shimkus from Southern Illinois, big old fella, should have been a tackle, I guess, on a football team, but we played basketball together, and we just got to know each other. And on the Energy and Commerce Committee, he and I were on a lot of opposite sides of each other, but we understood where we came from, and that he's not the enemy. He's our friend that maybe we can work with. And we did that in the committee in Energy and Commerce, because I was proud of some of the things we were get done. That was very, very bipartisan.
All I have about this is your staffs are key, right? They're vital. If you don't have good staff, they represent you. They do a lot of the work. They're in your ear. They're helping you during your very, very busy day. So one thought is, do the staffs work with each other? Do they socialize so that part, the civility part there, is maintained or enhanced? Did you see a lot of interaction between staffs of different parties where they were socializing and doing things together?
Well, I think that your staff is really the backbone. And I used to tell people, I tell that, you know, they don't know what most people don't know and care what votes I'm doing because we have so many votes. I said, if somebody, like Ted said earlier, had trouble getting into the VA hospital, your Social Security, and things like that, I said, that's what people remember and will talk to their neighbors about. And I had my district staff was always good because I explained to them, I said, everybody who's a constituent needs to be out to call me. But I want y'all to ask their problem and do the work. And if they can't get it done, I'll find some agency that I can get. We had a lot of issues with our VA medical center over the years. And I told my staff who did veterans work that I said, you get the things, but I would go out on Sunday afternoon and visit any constituent who was in the VA hospital. And it was having a member of Congress walk through up to the desk and say, I have a constituent here and I want to see how he's doing. And that huge bureaucracy. And that helps get that service to those folks. But I was all happy. And I rule in my office, if a constituent called, I don't care how much they raise Cain with you, you don't get paid enough to do that. Just tell them, I will call you back. And I would, at night, and when we're not having votes, I would call those folks back. And just the first thing they would do is say, are you really Gene? And they're surprised. And I know Ted, they had the same situation, but I enjoyed doing that because that was literally groundwork to serve your constituents.
Little follow up on that. The staff, I think I had the best staff in Congress. And like Gene mentioned, they're doing things other than legislation. The staff back here in Texas are working on personal issues. I had two staffers, for example, that were veterans, both female, one from Iraq and one from Afghanistan. One was a wounded warrior, and they did all my veterans and military. With their background, they were excellent about helping other people, veterans, with VA issues. But the other half of your staff does work primarily in Washington on legislation. And they have to get along with the other party's staff to get legislation passed. And so that is important. And I think for the most part, staff do a pretty good job of getting along with each other, because if you're trying to get someone in the other party to help sponsor a bill, your staff's got to get along with that staffer, whoever it is, on whatever issue, whether it's foreign affairs or judiciary or energy and commerce. And I think our staffs did that very well. And one thing advantage the Texas members of Congress have, all 36 of us, there's a group in Washington called the Texas State Society, which is made up of representatives from the state of Texas. Doesn't make a difference what party we're in. And the Texas State Society does really off-campus things, socialize, talking about Texas and different events where we get members of the Texas delegation together. And it makes other delegations in other states very jealous that we all get together and socialize so that we get along. And I think the Texas delegation, for the most part, does get along, both parties. But the staff is important, and they got to be able to get along with people as well, including the member.
It's the leadership of the member. Let me tell one more story. When a lot of our troops were going into Iraq, and I do town hall meetings in our district, and a father came to my staff and said, my son is in western Iraq, and he has a sergeant who is just mean as can be. I said, I thought that was a job, but and he said, so I told the guy, the fellow was also his dad was a veteran in Pasadena. And I said, well, give me his address. And we went and got a care box to put things in, things that didn't melt and things like that, and sent it over there. And I wrote I write an individual note to him. And I did this a number of times. And a few weeks later, after that package and he said, my sergeant goes down when we get mail and he looks at what y'all are getting. And so I had this note card from me and giving him, all sorts of stuff that the soldiers wanted. And his dad called me and said, I want to thank you. His sergeant hasn't messed with him yet again. And I never didn't go on a trip to Iraq or Afghanistan, because those were people who were from our district. They were defending our country, and so that's like I said, I'm not on armed forces, and I wasn't on armed forces where they do it all. But if I could anywhere get on a plane and go with them, and because I wanted to see, particularly if they're troops, I had the Houston Marine unit when they were activated. I had a couple of folks from there, and I went out there, but they were out in the bad part. They said, we can't let you get out there. But I said, well, I want them to know here, and I got all these boxes I'm giving them. But just showing you care for people, and definitely for someone who's defending our country.
Go ahead. I was just going to mention, I was on foreign affairs, and chairman of the terrorism subcommittee. I just mentioned that because I was able to go to Iraq and Afghanistan several times and see our troops. But when you travel overseas, the general rule is you always go on a bipartisan delegation. And when I traveled, I would even if it was just me, it'd be one other member of Congress. It'd be a Democrat. And on those types of trips, whether you're going to Afghanistan or Uzbekistan or wherever, going with people in both parties, that helps a lot on the issue of civility, because we're there both representing the United States, but also our constituents. And that promoted, I think, a lot of cooperation for members of Congress, because they travel together overseas, see our troops.
I have a question or a statement from Ronnie, and he states the following. He served in Congress as a staff member from 1980 to 2010, so 30 years. And he traces the divide in civility to the pre-Gingrich and post-Gingrich era. So, and I think, Judge Poe, you served post-Gingrich, but Congressman Green, you were there right when that was starting to happen. Could you guys give us a sense if that statement may be true, or there's something to it? I mean, I could be throwing a grenade here, by the way, because you both maybe disagree, but I'd be curious. And so would Ronnie.
Well, I was elected in 92, and then in 94, the Democrats lost the majority, and Newt Gingrich became our speaker. And, on one-on-one with him, you could joke with him, but he was, he started some of the things that separate us instead of bring us together. In fact, after he left, Congress started doing bipartisan things, bringing your family to, and we had civility, meetings away from the Capitol over a weekend, and your family could come. And but that when I left, I couldn't remember we had one of those in the last 15 years to get people to be able to work, get that I was a good father to his family and things like that. But and it's gotten much worse now, I think.
Paul, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I think there has been, just in the 15 years I was there, the trend is being partisan, to be partisan. And I blame both party leadership for that. Uh, my opinion, the leadership does not want people to get along with each other to pass legislation. I think that's where we've gotten to. But when I first started, I thought that there were the picnics and there were the the annual baseball game with the at the National Stadium. All of those things were promoted the civility, getting along, partisanship. But now I think everybody in the public understands that there is a very strong divide between the two parties getting along in Washington now. Changed a great deal.
Yeah.
Shift directions. First, I'd like to focus on preparing the next generation of leaders. And I want to start by thanking you both for hosting many hobby school interns for years in your congressional offices. We often hear from students about how transformational these opportunities are for them. And what advice do you have for young people interested in public service career, given what you have done?
Well, being a University of Houston student, I had to work my way through, and we've had a lot of interns that getting credit. And there was a rule at one time: if you were getting paid, you couldn't get credit. And I hope that we've changed that, because, in the University of Houston, we have people who work but they can't. They may get credit for working in an office, but we would always try and give some type of stipend for folks that come in.
Internships are very important. We had a lot of interns. We didn't pay them anything most of the time, and they were there from different places. I had, of course, University of Houston interns as well. One thing that I'm going to go ahead and say now: when you work in Congress, the staffs are expected to work long hours, because the members of Congress generally work long hours. And that includes, in many cases, interns. When you're in Washington and D.C. and you're in session, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It starts before that, and many times members of Congress work very late on the House of Representatives, and staffs do the same thing. They have to work long hours as well. I think there is a great misconception among the public universally that members of Congress have cushy jobs, work long hours. Most members of Congress work very long hours, and then they work on weekends as well when they get back to their districts. But their staffs do the same thing. And good entry point is always an intern or getting any job in a member of Congress's office, doing anything, because there are other positions as well. I think it shocks a lot of people how hard they're working once they get to work as a staffer in a member's office.
So one takeaway then is if you're interested in career in public service, a really, really good way to just get involved is becoming an intern, volunteer, right? And it's free. And now you get to see how the sausage is made, correct? I mean, that's interns. Any other things besides internships that you think would work to help?
Well, working in campaigns too. It's a good place to start. Many interns end up being interns because they had worked in somebody's campaign as a volunteer as well. And that person gets elected, then they're an intern in the office. So I would back up even to the campaign is a good place to get interested. And also, when you're in a campaign, you see what it's like. You may decide, this is not a good idea for me, when you find out public service and the campaign portion of it.
I guess this leads to another question. I mean, so you're alluding to it already, and I think a lot of people don't know. I mean, I worked in DC for 5 years, and I'm an egghead, I'm an academic. So going and working in the National Science Foundation, working with staff, and I was more than impressed by the hours they put in. So I guess I'd like to just ask both of you, what's it like being an elected official? Start with what it's like during the day. I mean, so Is it 14 hours, 16 hours? And just not only that, you've got to travel once a week, at least once a week, right? So let's start with what it's like just an average day, which isn't average for most of us, I suspect. Congressman Green?
Well, on the Democratic side, I think Republicans have the same thing. We have lots of meetings starting at 8 in the morning, not necessarily, caucuses and things like that. But that just starts it, and you stay there all day. If we're voting, it could be 10 or 11 at night. But you're torn from a lot of things. I wanted to be close to the district, and I always had a list of people who called, and I would do that. And some of our committees, and Ted knows that, if you're on 2 or 3 major committees, you're going to be on a bunch of subcommittees, and you don't have time. You only have one body, and so you had to get run during the day just to show up at a committee hearing and to make sure something was, you had your input on it. But it's the long hours, because those 8 o'clock meetings and in the morning, like caucuses and things like that. But it's part of the job, and we don't get drafted.
Judge Poe?
Long hours and their conflicts. That is the biggest issue members of Congress have to deal with during the day, is where to be. Look on their schedule, and they're supposed to be in 3 different places, 2 different committees, and also on the House floor debating legislation. When Congress is in session, we're in session all day as far as legislation goes, on the House floor, debate, etc. But you have other conflicts with committees, seeing people, and constant conflicts in making the decision where to be. My scheduler during the day blocked off 15-minute segments. Now, sometimes it was more than one 15-minute segment, but I'm given my schedule, and lots of conflicts, decisions made during the day, and you have to make sure you know where to be. And we work late. Once again, the staff does the same thing, and you have to pick the right place to be, which committee, because they meet at the same time. Congress is in session. You got people standing in the office wanting to talk to you from your home town. So, but I liked all that. I liked the intensity of what is taking place in Congress. I kind of thrived on it, to tell you the truth.
I'm going to get in the weeds a little bit. So you both have your schedules. You're both doing this. So you're preparing the night before, right, for the next day. Usually you get a phone call and you're working your schedule that night before you go to sleep. Here's what we got to do, right? And then Judge Paul, you said you prioritize. You got a way to prioritize which committee you need to be on. What was the basis? What would you use to prioritize? Was it the importance of the issue to you, or to the president, or to what was it that would make you say, I'm going to go here instead of there?
Mainly, it was whether or not I had legislation pending in that committee at that day, and if not, then I would try to go to a committee where I could speak. In other words, I'd show up at a committee and start speaking on a piece of legislation or what was discussed there, and then go back to another committee. So I would base it on if I was able to speak or debate that particular issue, whether I was interested in that, whether it was important to our district. So you'd base it on that, where you could be the most effective. Sometimes I'd be in a committee, I'd get a call from the House floor. It's your time to debate XYZ bill. And then I'd run over there, put my 2 cents in on the legislation, and come back to the committee. So your life, like I said, your life is controlled by that schedule card, where you can be the most effective at the specific time of that day.
Congressman Green, your thoughts on this?
I think that's so true, because you have appointments in your DC office, and when people would come in and we were having votes on the floor, and some of them were and so I have staff bring them over to the house, outside the house floor, so I could not miss a vote, but also be able to talk to these folks on whatever issue they were having. It's, you run all day, and it's as Ted said, it's exciting, but I'm sure every night I was glad to be there. My wife told me one time, because our kids, when they went to college, and I was used to calling them, and she said I'd call them at 8 a.m, a college student. My son went to A&M Galveston, and our daughter was at UT, and she finally told them, they don't want you to call. They want to talk to you, but they don't want you to call them at 8. I said, well, that's my early part of the day, and I get it. Does something to talk to them about. But anyway, the world doesn't move on a congressional schedule, or your family does.
Yeah, there's more to this, though. I mean, so you've got this organized chaos you're dealing with, but there's also living, right? So, I mean, there are stories of a lot of representatives that don't have an apartment, don't have a house, don't have a condo. They sleep in their office, and then they come back to their home district. So in terms of how the two of you did this, did you have a house, a condo, or were you one of the people that slept in your office? Oh.
I wish I could sleep in my office, but when I was first elected, I rented an apartment close to the Capitol, and because I didn't have a car, and but later on I got a car, and I went home every weekend because I had events on Saturdays. I never did an event on Sunday except somebody inviting us to something going on, but it was, and I finally found that the rent on the apartment was much more than my home payment, and in DC, and so we bought a condo, and for the last few years. And I was so happy when my wife retired. She was a teacher, taught 26 years high school algebra at Aldine High and also Nimitz, and but when she could come up with me, it was so much better, instead of seeing her on weekends and talking to her every day. But I'll tell you one story. Our son went to A&M Galveston. He was a marine science major, and I'd come home on Friday, and my chief of staff, Rhonda, who was in the district office at that time, said, we got a call from the administration at A&M Galveston, and Chris didn't pay his tuition for this semester. And I called him, and I said, well, he didn't send it to me, but I said, what do I have this afternoon? Do I have about an hour and a half so I can go to Galveston and pay his tuition? And I go in there, and my son, to this day, everybody loves him. He's fun. And I go in, and I said, let me, I'll write the check for the students, for the money. And I said, but is there, because they were a smaller campus at that time, they're much bigger now. And I said, what room is he in now? And I'd like to just see him when the class gets over and say hello to him. She said, oh, we'll send for him. And they got him to come. And I said, Chris, what happened to your, to what we were paying? And the lady said, he's really a nice guy. Everybody here loves him. But he didn't do that. And that was the last time he did that. With an hour and 15 minutes to Galveston. But you have to also be a father, and that has to fit in somewhere.
Oh,
I lived in an old 1887 brownstone with 3 other members of Congress, and it was bipartisan too. Most of those 15 years, well, we always wanted 4 people so we could pay the rent, but I was always in the basement. They would never let me go upstairs to the main house. I was regulated to the basement for those 15 years. It did remind me of college, and it was a little small basement, but it was close to the Capitol. Like Gene, I commuted every weekend for most of those 15 years. I'd come back to Humble, Texas, and Saturdays work, see people in the district. Sundays, I like Gene. I did not. I mean, your staff would work you to death if you let them, as far as meetings go. And Sundays, I'd go to church. Although I did think some people at church would interrupt me in a prayer if they could to tell me something about what they thought. But but commuted all those 15 years, and that's the way I handled it as well.
Pat, on bipartisanship, the folks are really interested in this. So I guess for some of the remaining time, what are some things you think could be done to kind of, if anything, what could be done to start to make this, pull us back from the precipice of just being at each other's throats all the time? Is there campaign finance reform? Are there some rules that could be changed?
Well, it looks like we have a problem with the Zoom. But can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think this time, and just being on the outside for 4 or 5 years, there's no effort to have bipartisan and the leadership on both sides. Like I said, we used to have a weekend, maybe a year, and we would have a bipartisan retreat and get to know the people who are not on your committee or not part of your state or anything. And but the partisan now we see is coming from our constituents, and that's part of our problem. You want your constituents to be happy, and but Ted, I don't know if we had a solution, we would have done
it. That's true, and it's pretty obvious that there is. I'll go back to the leadership, and leadership is not, to me, promoting bipartisanship as far as legislation goes, or even getting along, which is kind of a shock to me, because always, the House of Representatives is a debating society where you got 435 members with at least 4 or 5 times that many opinions apiece on any subject, and be able to communicate and debate those different issues, disagree without being so mean about it. And I think now we've kind of gotten a whole away from that. And I'll go back to when I was there. Like most pieces of legislation are not partisan. The Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, probably most people never even heard of it. It's the major legislation in the country now that deals with trafficking. And I was the lead sponsor in the House. Carolyn Maloney, a Democrat from New York that's somewhat liberal, and I were the 2 sponsors, and it passed the House of Representatives, passed the Senate, became law. I was president when President Obama signed the legislation. The best legislation is always bipartisan, and we got along to get that legislation because it was necessary. And I think that's a perfect example of how we can work. We worked together, and Gene has a whole lot more examples than that to get good legislation passed. But it seems those days are over, where people work together on a specific issue that hadn't have anything to do with politics. I mean, I don't think human sex trafficking has anything to do with politics, but and I really don't have the answer, except that's got to come from the top in both parties to work with the other side on everything, really.
Well, Ted, you're right, because the partisanship comes from the top. But you and I know we didn't have the leadership telling us to speak to your neighbor. And
that's true.
Yeah, but every individual member, like we were neighbors, our district were neighbors. We had the same issues that our constituents in Houston and Baytown and Spring, but I hope nobody gets elected to Congress to start a fight.
Well said. Well said.
So in the remaining minutes, one issue I wanted to raise with both of you is let us know one or two things you're most proud of in public service. Was it a piece of legislation? What was it that you just, wow, I'm really glad I was part of that and I did that? And Congressman Green, please go first.
Okay. When I first was elected, I was working on a lot of education because in the state Senate, I was on the education committee, and in Texas, our education has always been a big issue. And in 1993 and 94, we were reauthorizing the federal education funds for, and I had a battle with Senator Ted Kennedy because I had a district that was not wealthy. My school districts, low tax and things like that, but he was chair of the education committee in the Senate, and the formula he came out didn't give my folks who was still, who were poor, the same thing that those kids in Boston, Massachusetts, and we went to a conference committee, and with it, and the chair of the Democratic committee was from Michigan, and he let me get after it, and then, but we had a retreat, and Senator Kennedy was there, and a number of people, and and we got that bill passed, but then when I got on energy and commerce, I was healthcare. I had a district that always didn't have insurance, health insurance, and so I wanted to expand, and that's why in the Affordable Care Act we should have expanded Medicaid to everyone who couldn't afford insurance, and Texas is not doing that, although Congress someday will tell you, if you take this Medicaid problem, you're going to have to take them all. And that's, and in fact, when we thought we were going to get the majority my last couple terms, and I had a bill that we were going to get out and say, if Texas or Louisiana or New York, if you take Medicaid, you take the whole thing, not just folks who can't afford it and their employer doesn't provide health insurance.
Mr. Poe?
Well, when I was a judge for 22 years, hearing all those different felonies, I started doing some unusual things. We don't have time to go into those. All legal, by the way, and all those that were appealed were all upheld. Press called it poetic justice, but it was more public punishment. And I was proud of those because they worked. The recidivism rate was extremely low, whereas generally speaking, recidivism rate's pretty high nationally and in Harris County. On the congressional side, I was chairman of the Victims' Rights Caucus. Co-chairman was Emmanuel Cleaver from, not Emmanuel Cleaver. He was the World War I memorial, but I'll mention briefly. But Jim Costa, Democrat from California. We worked on victims legislation, helping our Peace Corps volunteers who were assaulted overseas, making sure that they were protected. Major legislation was the trafficking legislation that I mentioned with Carolyn Maloney. And lastly, in Washington, D.C., we have memorials for World War II, Vietnam, and Korea. But there's no World War I memorial for the doughboys that fought at the turn of the last century. And so Emmanuel Cleaver and I worked on that. Started in 2015, finally got the legislation passed, and they are constructing a World War I memorial now in Washington, D.C. for those veterans that were killed and survived in World War I. It's going to be a great memorial in honor of those. And then also veterans legislation. We have a lot of veterans in our district, and we worked with them. And we had 36. Lastly, we had 36 members of the U.S. military from our congressional district area killed while I was in Congress. We worked very close with their families and also on legislation for our military with the veterans. So we were busy, and I enjoyed being in Congress and working on those issues and other issues, bipartisan issues.
Well, just a little bit with you, Judge Poe. This poetic justice policy you had, what's an example? Is it like if you did DUI, would you make them wear a sign outside saying I was driving drunk the other day? Is that the kind of thing? My parents would do that to me, by the way. So yeah.
That would be possible to carry the sign. And there were a lot of sign carriers, and it was generally first offenders, young people. The first guy, I won't mention what university he went to, but it wasn't the U of H. And he liked to steal, and he was a habitual thief. He loved stealing. So when he was finally caught on multiple times, he did carry a sign out in front of the Walmart. I stole from this store. Don't be a thief, or this will be you. I didn't know if that would work or not. It did. He said it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Changed his ways. He now is an engineer in Houston, and had called me during my term after that in the judiciary, giving me ideas about that. So as public punishment, Texas law allows for a judge to order that the punishment be public in public notice of the crime in the county in which the crime was committed. So that was sign carriers, and you'd see those on street corners. I did have that first case, the owner of the Walmart, or the manager of the Walmart, after the week was over, the guy was out there. The manager called and said, Judge Poe, the week that person was carrying a sign, I didn't have any stealing going on in the store. Well, that message is going to other people. So there would be those types of punishments. I had a lady, an older lady, have her car stolen by a teenager, and he wrecked it. So I made him give her his car until hers was repaired. We had a ceremony there in the courtroom where he gave her the car keys to his car, and things like that. Like I said, most of those public punishment cases, those people did not come back to the courthouse because sentencing. Judges need to do some sentencing that makes sense, that gets the attention of the offender, but also the victim and also the community. So there were a lot of those different types of sentencing.
Well, gentlemen, first, thank you for participating today, but most of all, thank you for your public service. I mean, there's nothing but respect for both of you. I just, what you do for us and done for us is just greatly appreciated. And that concludes our hobby hour for today. I want to thank again Congressman Gene Green and Judge Ted Poe for participating today and covering a variety of topics. Mark your calendars for our next hobby hour, which is going to be on November 10th at noon, as we discuss the results of the decennial census and how Texas population growth is impacting district lines throughout the state. Our panelists for that hobby hour will be Michael Adams, Professor of Political Science at Texas Southern, Renee Cross, Senior Director of the Hobby School, Mark Jones, Rice University Fellow in Political Science and Senior Research Fellow at the Hobby School, and Dick Murray, Senior Research Fellow at the Hobby School. Thank you all, and thank you again, Congressman and Judge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.